illegal aliens at this point, and also addressing the question of border security.
Well, what about the 11 million undocumented people who are already here?
Well, Congress is is able to determine that policy as part of immigration legislation.
So that is the largest group of undocumented people. They are the largest group of people who are here illegally, and as you say, you would like to.
The zero tolerance policy, as I understand it, has to do with people who are coming in.
Yes, I know that, but
illegally.
you know that when I talk about the 11 million people, that they are undocumented. They live in the shadows. Many of them do pay taxes, and so that is the largest group that's here. This is why we worked really hard for comprehensive immigration reform. I hope that you support that kind of effort. Do you believe birthright citizenship is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment?
I haven't looked at that issue.
It says right there in the 14th Amendment that anyone born born in this country is a U.S. citizen. And there are those who think that that should be done away with. Are you one of them?
Could you give us a brief answer, Mr.?
Yeah, as I say, I haven't looked at that issue legally. That's the kind of issue I would ask OLC to advise me on, as to whether it's something that's appropriate for legislation. I don't even know the answer to that.
It's certainly been interpreted for a long time as saying that people who are born in this country are citizens. Shall I continue, or should I ask for a third round?
I think the chairman would like to finish today, and I think your time's expired.
So I can't ask for a third round?
I'm fine. You can have third, fourth, fifth round.
Thank you.
But I'm not chairman.
I just have a few more. I can wait.
Okay. Why don't we do that?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I think I'm next, Mr. Barr. We talked about this earlier. I think we can agree, can we not, that hundreds of thousands, millions of words have been written speculating about what happened at the Department of Justice and the FBI in the 2016 election with respect to the two-party nominees. Can we agree on that?
Yes.
Can we agree that the American people have a right to know what happened at Justice and the FBI?
Yes.
Okay. Why don't we just declassify all the documents and show them to the American people and let the American people draw their own conclusions?
I'm not in a position to say because I don't have access to the documents and I don't know what it entails.
Well, it entails the truth, does it not?
Yes, but presumably if they're classified, there could be collateral consequences, and I'm not in a position to make that judgment.
Well, I mean, is your mind open on that, Mr. Barr? Or
I think generally,
I don't understand why properly redacted those documents have not been shown to the American people. They're smart enough to figure it out.
I think ultimately the best policy is to let the light shine. If there have been mistakes made, the best policy is to allow light to shine in and for people to understand what happened. But sometimes, you have to determine when the right time to do that is.
I understand. I'm asking that you seriously consider that, and I'm talking about the investigations with respect to Secretary Clinton and President Trump. Clearly, the FBI and the Department of Justice, I'm not saying that either was imprudent to do so, but we've seen bits and pieces, and there's been a lot of speculation and innuendo, and people have drawn conclusions based on incomplete facts, and it would seem to me that if for no other reason but the integrity of the FBI and Justice Department, both of which I hold in great esteem, we should redact the portions that would endanger somebody and show the American people the documents. And I wish you'd seriously consider that.
I will, Senator.
And I, having watched you here today, I think you will. I think you'll give it serious consideration.
Yes.
Let me ask your opinion on something else. About 10 years ago, we had a problem with our banking system in America, and we had a lot of bankers who made loans to borrowers when the bankers and the borrowers knew the money was not going to be paid back. That's called fraud, and it's illegal. And then some of those same bankers and other bankers took those garbage loans and they packaged them together into security, and they sold them to investors without telling the investors that the underlying loans were toxic. That's called securities fraud. And I don't know how many billions of dollars of this bad paper was sold, but I know a lot of people in the banking industry got rich doing it. And as a result, the American economy and almost the world economy almost melted down. Now, the Department of Justice prosecuted virtually no one, no banking executives over this. Why? I realize they made the banks pay some money, but I saw banking fraud and I saw securities fraud, and nobody was prosecuted.
I can't answer that, Senator, but I can say that I was in charge of the S&L cleanup after it was over. It was put under me in the deputy's office. And
you folks prosecuted people.
we prosecuted a lot of people and very quickly, and we cleaned it up very quickly. How many did we get? Over 900 convictions in very short order.
I don't think we had 9 this time. I mean, what message does that send to the American people?
Well,
I mean, I'll tell you what the message it sends is that the people at the top can cut corners and get away with it.
Well, I can say, Senator, I think my experience with the SNL shows that I'm not afraid of going after fraud
I know that.
at the corporate level, and it was one of the most successful, I think, government responses to that kind of whole sector meltdown that there's been. So I'm very proud of the job that was done by the department on that.
As you know, as we say in Louisiana, you were mean as a mama wasp, and you did the right thing. But I don't think we did the right thing with the banking meltdown. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. Thank you, Mr. Barr. You've declined, or I'd say refused, to commit to following the advice of the career ethics officials at DOJ with regards to recusal from the ongoing special counsel investigation. Will you at least commit to notify this committee once you receive the ethics officials' guidance? Tell us what it was and explain whether you agreed or disagreed with it.
To tell you the truth, Senator, I don't know what the rules are and what the practice is, but off the top of my head, I don't think I would have an objection to that.
So you'd be comfortable letting us know that you'd received an ethics opinion and either declined to follow?
But I'm not sure what the practice and the rules are. I generally try to follow the rules.
You said earlier in this hearing you have an interest in transparency with regards to the final report of the Mueller investigation. But I didn't hear a concrete commitment about release. And I think this is a very significant investigation, and you've been very forthcoming about wanting to protect it. The DOJ has released information about declination memos, about descriptions of decisions not to prosecute in the past. I'll cite the Michael Brown case, for example. Would you allow Special Counsel Mueller to release information about declination memos in the Russia investigation as he sees fit?
I actually don't think Mueller would do that because it would be contrary to the regulations. But that's one of the reasons I want to talk to Mueller and Rosenstein and figure out, what the lay of the land is.
But if appropriate, under current regulations, you wouldn't have any hesitation about saying prosecutorial decisions should be part of that final report?
As I said, I want to get out as much as I can under the regulations.
You also,
I think that's the reason I say it's vitally important.
Right.
It's related to my feeling that it's really important to, let the chips fall where they may and get the information out.
you also said in response to my first round of questions that the special counsel regulations shouldn't be rescinded during this investigation. Just to be clear, you would refuse to rescind them if the president asked, even if that meant you'd have to resign?
Well, that came up in the context of wanting to change the rules so Mueller could be fired.
Right.
That where there was no good cause.
No good cause, correct.
And I said there, yeah, I would not agree to that.
There's another ongoing investigation in the Southern District of New York in which I would argue the president's implicated as individual number one. If the president ordered you to stop the SDNY investigation in which someone identified as individual one is implicated, would you do that?
Well, that goes back to an earlier explanation I gave, which is every decision within the department has to be made based on the Attorney General's independent conclusion and assessment that it's in accordance with the law. And so I would not stop a bona fide lawful investigation.
So if the president sought to fire prosecutors in the Southern District of New York to try and end the investigation into his campaign, would that be a crime? Would that be an unlawful act?
Well, I mean, that one, usually firing a person doesn't stop the investigation. That's one of the things I have a little bit of trouble accepting. But to answer, the basic point is, if someone tried to stop a bona fide lawful investigation to cover up wrongdoing, I would resign.
Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein has said publicly your memo had no impact on the special counsel investigation. If you're confirmed and you're supervising the special counsel investigation, would you order the special counsel's office to accept and follow the reasoning in your memo?
I would probably talk to Bob Mueller about it. If I felt there was a difference of opinion, I would try to work it out with Bob Mueller. At the end of the day, unless something violates the established practice of the department, I would have no ability to overrule that.
You were Attorney General when President Bush pardoned 6 administration officials charged with crimes arising from the Iran-Contra scandal, and you encouraged the president to issue those pardons. Is it permissible for a president to pardon a member of his administration in order to prevent testimony about illegal acts?
Is it permissible under what?
Would it strike you as obstruction of justice for him to exercise his presidential pardon power for the purpose of preventing testimony?
Yeah, I think that if a pardon was a quid pro quo to altering testimony, then that would definitely implicate an obstruction statute.
Would it be permissible for the president to pardon family members
Let me
simply because they're family members?
Let me say that. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
2 last questions, and then we'll be done. Do you think it would be permissible for the president to pardon a family member simply because they're a family member, and where the purpose, the motive is unclear? And do you think it would be permissible for a president to pardon himself?
Okay, so here, the problem is, under the Constitution, there are powers, but you can abuse a power. So the answer to your question, in my opinion, would be, yes, he does have the power to pardon a family member, but he would then have to face the fact that he could be held accountable for abusing his power. Or if it was connected to some act that violates an obstruction statute, it could be obstruction.
How would he be held accountable?
Well, in the absence of a violation of a statute, which is, as you know, in order to prosecute someone, they have to violate a statute. In the absence of that, then he'd be accountable politically.
Thank you for your interest today.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Barr, thank you for your patience and for staying with us today. A couple of questions. We've talked about border security and immigration law, and that is something that I want to return to. I appreciated your comments about going after the problem at the source, and I think that is so vitally important when we talk about the immigration issues and we look at what has happened when you're talking about drug traffickers and human traffickers, the gangs. that are coming across that southern border, and I do think that a barrier is there. But one of the symptoms, if you will, of an open border policy has been the sanctuary city policy. And that pertains to those that are illegally in the country. And I tell you what, it is just absolutely heartbreaking to me every time I meet with an angel mom and I hear these stories. And then after Officer Singh was murdered, hearing that local law enforcement officer talk about, and talk with specificity about how sanctuary policies emboldened those that were illegally in the country. And when you look at this practice of sanctuary city, you know, if we don't do something consistent in this realm, then what is to say you don't develop sanctuary cities for other violations of the law, whether it's tax law or environmental protection law or traffickers or any other. So talk to me for just a minute about what your connection will be between dealing with the sanctuary cities and then dealing with some of these problems at the source. How do you've talked about compartmentalizing and putting lieutenants in charge, and this is an issue that affects every single community, because until we stop some of this, we're going to have every state a border state and every town a border town.
So, I just think of it as immigration. You have pull factors and push factors. There are factors down in Latin America that are pushing people up, and there are attractions to the United States that are pulling them up. And one of the, I think a pull factor is things like sanctuary cities, the idea that you can come in and not be, and get away with flouting our laws and coming in. And so I think that's one of the concerns I have about sanctuary cities. The second concern I have is that the sanctuary city problem is a criminal alien problem. I think a lot of people are under the impression that sanctuary cities are there to protect, the illegal aliens who are quietly living as productive members of society and paying their taxes, as Senator Arona said. It isn't. The problem with sanctuary cities is that it is preventing the federal government from taking custody of criminal aliens. And it's a deliberate policy to frustrate the apprehension of criminal aliens by the federal government. So I don't think those cities should be getting federal.
Do you think it would be abided with any other violation of U.S. law?
No, I don't. And there's a legal issue, which is the question of what's the word? Commandeering. The states argue that for their law enforcement officers who have custody of a criminal alien to notify the federal government on a timely basis so that they can turn that fugitive essentially over to the federal government, that's commandeering state apparatus under the Prince case, and therefore it's, the federal government shouldn't have that power. That's the issue. And I personally am very skeptical of the commandeering argument. That was adopted where the federal government passed gun control legislation and basically were ordering the states to set up the whole background check and everything else. The idea here is simply one law enforcement agency notifying another and holding the person until they can be picked up. So I'm skeptical that that's commandeering, but that's the legal issue.
My time is expiring, and I know we need to finish this up, but I do look forward to talking with you again about China and the intellectual property violations, the way they go in and re-engineer steal from our innovators, and of course the way they're forcing fentanyl and illicit drugs through our ports and through that open, porous southern border that we have to secure. Thank you. Yield back.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to join in thanking you for your patience. I'm hoping that I can get through all my questions on this round. I don't know whether the chairman will accede to a short third round, but let me just try as best I can. On the pardon issue and accountability, you would agree that the president pardoning someone in return for changing his or her testimony would be an abuse of the pardon power, and the president should be held accountable.
And, well, a quid pro quo to change testimony could potentially be obstruction.
Or for not testifying at all would be obstruction of justice. If the special prosecutor or the prosecutor anywhere else came to you with proof beyond a reasonable doubt of that kind of obstruction or any other crime, talking proof beyond a reasonable doubt, would you approve an indictment of the president?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm not going to answer off the top of my head. But if we take it out of this context and say, if a prosecutor came and showed that there was a quid pro quo by which somebody gives something of value to induce false testimony or
It would be a crime.
Yes.
And the question is whether the president could be prosecuted while in office. I happen to believe that he could be, even if the trial were postponed until he is out of office, but because the statute of limitations might run for any other number of reasons, a prosecution would be appropriate. Would you agree?
Well, but, for 40 years, the position of the executive branch has been you can't indict a sitting president.
Well, it's the tradition based on a couple of OLC opinions, but now it is potentially an imminent, indeed immediate possibility, and I'm asking you for your opinion now, if possible, but if not now, perhaps at some point.
Are you asking me if I would change that policy?
I'm asking you what your view is right now.
I actually haven't read those opinions in a long time, but I see no reason to change them.
Well, I'm happy to continue this conversation with more time and another opportunity.
Sure.
I want to ask you about the Southern District of New York, which I believe is as important as the special prosecutor. As I mentioned earlier in my question before, the president has been named there, individual number one, as an unindicted co-conspirator. If the president fired the United States attorney, would you support continuing that investigation, even under the civil servants, the career prosecutors who would remain, assuming it is a legitimate prosecution?
Yeah. And I've tried to say it in a number of different ways. I believe, regardless of who or what outside the department is trying to influence what's going on, every decision within the department relating to enforcement, the Attorney General has to determine independently that it's a lawful action, and if there was a lawful bona fide investigation that someone was trying to squelch, I wouldn't tolerate that.
Putting it very simply, you would protect that investigation against political interference, as hopefully you would do
With any investigation in the
Exactly.
department.
Let me move on to something unrelated, if I may. In the early 1990s, thousands of Haitians tried to flee persecution in their own country by coming to the United States by boat. As you will remember, you oversaw, I believe, a program that sent thousands of them, some of them were HIV positive, to Guantanamo Bay. These asylum seekers were kept at Guantanamo Bay for 18 months. A federal judge in the Eastern District of New York described the living conditions in Guantanamo Bay by saying that asylum seekers were forced to live in camps, quote, surrounded by razor barbed wire, end quote, and compelled to, quote, tie plastic garbage bags to the sides of the building to keep the rain out, end quote. In an interview in 2001 at the Miller Center, you defended this program. Do you have regrets about it now? And am I correct in saying that these asylum seekers first started coming to the United States, it was your position that they should be kept there indefinitely?
I really appreciate the opportunity to address this. So in 1991, Aristide was overthrown in Haiti, and there was sort of a mass exodus from Haiti. And up until then, the policy of the United States had been until that time, administrations had forcibly returned Haitian asylum seekers and so forth without any kind of process. It was a humanitarian problem because a lot of these boats were sinking. It was a 600-mile journey. So the Coast Guard, there are two different issues. One issue is the processing of those who are healthy, and the second issue is the HIV. In a nutshell, the processing, we started actually giving them abbreviated asylum hearings on the ships. Eventually, we moved some of that to Guantanamo, and we were admitting to the United States 30%, which is the highest it's ever been. I mean, I think before that it was just minuscule. Later, when the Clinton administration adopted our policies, it went down to 5%, I am told. But in any event, then it became so overwhelming that we forcibly repatriated the Haitians because we felt that most of them, the conditions were changing. We didn't think that there was a threat in Haiti, and we were just overwhelmed, and we forcibly sent them back to Haiti. Meanwhile, HIV was an exclusion. You could not admit anyone with HIV, and this was adopted by the Senate, and then in the first year of the Clinton administration signed a bill that kept it as exclusion. You cannot admit someone with HIV except by case-by-case waiver based on extreme circumstance. So what we did with the HIV people is we first screened them for asylum, because if they couldn't claim asylum, then they wouldn't be admitted. And then we started a case-by-case review. I started admitting them on a case-by-case basis where cases could be made that there was a particular reason for doing it, like pregnant women and people who had not yet developed full-blown. I think there was a slowing down of the processing because people felt that the Clinton administration, which at the time was attacking these policies, was going to be more liberal. And so people thought, well, why should we go through this process with Bush when Clinton's right around the corner? Clinton came in, adopted our policies, and defended them in court, continued forced repatriation, continued the exclusion of HIV. As part of settling a case, he brought in 260.
Which didn't necessarily make it right.
Well, it was right under the law.
Did you favor keeping those Haitians in Guantanamo indefinitely?
No.
And
We were,
ask you,
I think most of the articles at the time said we were sort of in a catch-22. We were trying to process the HIV people on a case-by-case basis and inhumane conditions or anything like that. And that is not mentioned, I don't think, in the book written by the lawyers who represented them. So it was a mass exodus situation, and we did the best we could.
would you do it again in exactly the same way if you had it to do again?
I mean, I don't know. It would depend on the circumstances and also depend on whether we thought this was really a case of persecution.
Let me ask you this. Would you again house asylum seekers in Guantanamo?
Well, the Clinton administration did. In
I'm
fact,
asking
they
you-
doubled and they started putting other nationalities in there too. Probably not because of the associations of Guantanamo now.
Would you segregate asylum seekers in some other way then?
Well, I think it's always given the abuses of the asylum system right now, I would always prefer to process asylum seekers outside the United States.
And don't you think we should do a better job with asylum seekers in this country in terms of the kinds of facilities that we provide, particularly for women, children, families?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think if we're going to detain families, I think those have to be facilities that are safe and appropriate for young children.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again to you, Mr. Barr, for being willing to answer all these questions today. I want to continue on some of the same theme that Mr. Blumenthal raised a moment ago. He raised a couple of questions regarding immigration, regarding our asylum process. I think it's significant to note here that we have some in our political discourse today who are suggesting that the enforcement of our immigration laws and the enforcement of our border is somehow immoral, that it's somehow wrong. We've had people who, in one of the major political parties, multiple candidates be elected, campaigning, among other things, on either eviscerating ISIS power or abolishing the agency altogether. As you noted earlier today, you gave a speech back in 1992 in which you were one of the first people I remember using the metaphor of wanting to make sure that our immigrants come to this country through the front door and not through the back door, not through a side window or something to that effect. Can you just sort of describe to us why you think it's important that we draw a clear moral distinction between the enforcement of immigration laws, between legal immigration and illegal immigration? Is this the functional equivalent, in other words, of the premature removal of a do not remove tag on a mattress, or is it something more than that?
I think it's something more. I mean, we have built a great society here in the United States, and a vast majority, and I forgot what the statistic is, but a very large majority of the world lives under our poverty level. And for them, even, being poor in the United States would be a step up. And we have a lot to be grateful and thankful for here. And if it was unrestricted, a lot of people would come here, more than we could possibly accommodate. And
who would that harm first and foremost if we allowed that to happen? Would it be the wealthy who would most immediately be harmed by that?
No, it wouldn't. Yeah. And so it just seems obvious that you have to have a system of rationing. You have to have a system that makes determinations who can come and when. And Congress is in charge of that. They can make the laws and determine it. We, I think, have a very expansive system. There are people waiting in line for 10, 15, at least there were when I last looked at it, in the Philippines, for example, for over a decade, waiting patiently, law-abiding people who want to come here and have family here and other things like that. And just to allow people to come crashing in, be told that if you say this, you'll be treated as an asylum, and then you don't have to reappear for your hearing or whatever. It's just an abuse of the system, and it's unfair. I mean, all of us have been standing in lines, long lines, and someone just walks up to the front. That's unjust. That's unjust. I also think that without control, you have unsafe conditions and uncontrolled conditions on the border, which create serious safety problems for everybody on both sides of the border. So it creates uncontrolled access to the country as a national security threat. There are people around the world that are coming into Latin America for the purpose of coming up through the border. So these are the reasons why I think it's important that we have an enforceable system of laws, which right now the laws are sorely lacking.
Our desire to enforce our border is not unique to us. In fact, our neighbors on the southern side of our border in Mexico themselves have pretty strict laws which they enforce. And our neighbors in Mexico, including the officials in the new López Obrador administration with whom I visited recently, are themselves quite concerned about these uncontrolled waves of migration from Guatemala, from Honduras, from El Salvador. It occurs to me, and it has occurred to them, that it's important for us to figure out ways to turn off the magnets that are bringing these uncontrolled waves in. If you could wave a magic wand, is there anything, any change you would make to current asylum law or policy that you think we ought to consider?
I really couldn't say off the top of my head. I think I had some ideas a while back about, I'm talking decades ago, about how we could change it, because this has always been the problem. But I'd have to see exactly where the abuses are coming in and how we could deal with it.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I've got one more question. Could I,
Sure, absolutely.
with leave of the chairman, I want to get back very briefly to civil asset forfeiture. I referred briefly at the end of our previous exchange to a process whereby some state law enforcement agencies, seeing that they are prohibited from doing that which they would like to do under state law, will go to a federal law enforcement agency and agree to make the civil asset forfeiture that they want federal, such that it's no longer governed by state law. Sometimes that happens, and the Department of Justice will enter into an equitable sharing arrangement with that state, where the money is sort of, I don't like to use the word laundered, but it's filtered through the federal system deliberately in an effort to circumvent state law. Would banning this type of equitable sharing in civil asset forfeiture be something that you would be willing to do as Attorney General?
No, I couldn't say I'm willing to do it now because I don't know enough about it. I come at this, number one, that asset forfeiture is an important tool. Number two, that it's important, how we work with our state and local partners. But number three, as you could tell from my early statement on this matter, I am sensitive to creating a speed trap problem and also due process issues where amounts are stolen that, for all intents and purposes, it would be too costly for some individuals to go and try to, get back. So I'm open to looking at whether there are abuses, what kind of abuses occur, and try to redress those.
Okay, thank you. And it's my view that at least in that circumstance where it's prohibited by state law enforcement agencies shouldn't be able to make themselves whole. They shouldn't be able to seek the blessing of government simply by making it federal. So I hope you'll consider that and appreciate your remarks on due process. This really does touch on that, and it's right at the surface of a whole lot of constitutional rights. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Harris. I'm sorry, Booker, I apologize.
Gosh, you give a guy a little power as a chairman,
Well,
he starts to push you around.
I tell you what,
thought we were friends.
he's doing better than I am. I'm getting tired.
I
so
thought we were friends.
apologize. Apologies, we are friends.
I'm grateful, sir. Let me jump right in. And you wrote an article where you described how the law was being used, and this was your opinion, and maybe it's changed, because this was over a decade ago, where you said the breakdown traditional morality by putting on an equal plane conduct that was previously considered immoral, and you mentioned the homosexual movement, is what you described it, as one of the movements causing an erosion of morality in America. I can only gather from the article I'm quoting, unless your opinions have changed, that you believe that gay, bisexual, being gay or bisexual, lesbian, or transgender is immoral. Have your views changed on that?
No, but I don't think I said, I think you were paraphrasing there. What did I say about the homosexual movement?
I'll put in the record
Okay.
the article that you, and again, I'm quoting your actual language.
But I'll tell you my views. If I had been voting on it at the time, my view is that under the law, under the Constitution as I originally conceived it before it was decided by the Supreme Court, marriage was to be regulated by the states, and if it was brought to me, I would have favored marital unions, but single sex.
I guess I'm more asking: do you still believe that homosexuality is a movement, or that somehow that's immoral behavior?
What I was getting at is, I think there has to be a live and let, in a pluralistic society like ours, there has to be a live and let live attitude, and mutual tolerance, which has to be a two-way street. And my concern, and the rest of the article addresses this, is I am perfectly fine with the law as it is, for example, with gay marriage. Perfectly fine. But I want accommodation to religion. And what I was concerned about,
But I guess that's not my concern, sir. We live in a country right now where especially LGBTQ youth are disproportionately bullied at school. Many of them
hate crimes.
hate crimes, serious hate crimes. Many of them report missing school because of fear, disproportionately homeless. And I guess what I'm more concerned about is, do you believe that laws designed to protect LGBTQ individuals from discrimination contribute to what you described as a breakdown of traditional morality? The
No.
laws, you do not?
No.
Okay. Since,
But I'd like to say what I also believe there has to be accommodation to religious community.
you and I both believe in freedom of religion. I guess what I'm talking about, again, is discrimination. And I know you believe, you don't need to say for me that you believe that firing somebody simply because they're gay is wrong.
Totally wrong.
I understand that you believe that, but do you believe the right to not be fired just because of your sexual orientation should be something that should be protected under civil rights law?
I'm sorry. Your right not to be fired?
Sir, right
In
now.
other words, are you saying that it should be part of Title VII?
I'm saying that right now in the United States of America, in the majority of our states, someone can be fired. They could post their wedding pictures on their Facebook page and be fired the next day just because they're gay.
I think that's wrong.
You think that's wrong?
Yes.
And so you would believe that efforts by the Department of Justice to protect LGBT kids or individuals from harassment, from hate crimes, and efforts to protect the civil rights of LGBTQ Americans.
I support that.
You support that? Okay,
And that's
thank
why I
you.
said in the beginning, I am very concerned about the increase in hate crime.
Oh, I was really happy about that. You said you recognize that violence based on sexual orientation is not acceptable and that you will work to combat that. I was really happy to read that in your written testimony and hear it again. Will you recognize it then that there's a place for the Department of Justice, which is supposed to protect the civil rights of Americans, of vulnerable communities, that there's a place for the Department of Justice to protect the civil rights of LGBT Americans by banning discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity?
If Congress passes such a law, I think the litigation going on now on Title VII is what the 1964 Act actually contemplated. But personally, I think
I'm sorry, you do believe the 1964 Act contemplated protecting individuals from being discriminated upon by the base?
I think it was male-female that they were talking about when they said sex in the 64 Act.
So protecting someone's basic rights to be free from discrimination because of sexual harassment is not something that the Department of Justice should be protecting?
No. I'm saying Congress passes the law. The Justice Department enforces the law. I think the 64 Act on its face, and this is what's being litigated, what does it cover? I think for like 3 or 4 decades, the LGBT community was trying to amend the law.
But the Obama administration, as you know, the Justice Department under the Obama administration was working to protect LGBTQ kids from discrimination. Are those practices that you would be pursuing as well?
I don't know what you're referring to.
Why-
I
why
am
don't-
all for, I'm against discrimination against anyone because of some status like, their gender or their, or
I understand really briefly.
sexual orientation or whatever.
Thank you. With the indulgence of the chair, just very briefly, the Department of Justice reversed the federal government's position in BC versus Perry after arguing that almost 6 years that the Texas voter ID law intentionally discriminated against minorities. Even the Fifth Circuit of Appeal, one of the more conservative circuits, ruled that the Texas law discriminated against minority voters. You said very strongly that voting, the right to vote is paramount. And I'm wondering, if confirmed, will you bring the Department of Justice back on into the to the mode of defending the right to vote, because they've now pulled out of a lot of cases that were affirming people's access for the right to vote?
I will vigorously enforce the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, and then I'll just say, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say to you, please, I hope we get a chance to talk more. I imagine this is our second round, and I'm grateful for you today answering my questions. Thank you, sir.
Now, Senator Harris.
Thank you.
So you were the Attorney General, obviously, under President George H.W. Bush, and in the Reagan White House, a senior policy advisor. So I'm going to assume that you are familiar with the Presidential Records Act. And my question is, in the context of a Washington Post report that the president took possession of an interpreter's notes documenting the president's meeting with the Russian President Putin in 2017. And the question then is, does that violate the Presidential Records Act?
Your initial assumption, I'm afraid, was wrong. I'm not familiar with that act.
You're not familiar
At
at all
some
with it?
time I was, but I really don't know what it says.
You don't know what it says?
No.
Okay.
At
It
some
basically-
time-
it
at some
requires
point
the
I was-
president to keep documents and not destroy them, essentially.
At one point I knew what it said, but I'm not familiar with it right now.
Okay. In December, a Texas judge struck down the Affordable Care Act. If the decision is upheld, the results could include an estimated 17 million Americans losing their health insurance in the first year alone. Protections for pre-existing conditions would be eliminated, and seniors would pay more for prescription drugs, and some adults would no longer be able to stay on their parents' insurance plans until the age of 26. Attorney General Sessions refused to defend the Affordable Care Act in court. As you know, when there is a change of Attorney General in the Justice Department, there is often a change of priorities from the previous AG. So in the context of also understanding that many lawyers, including conservative legal scholars, have criticized the Texas decision, including Philip Klein of the Washington Examiner, would you reverse the Justice Department's position and defend the Affordable Care Act in court?
That is a case that I, if I'm confirmed, would
If
want.
confirmed.
If I'm confirmed, I would like to review the department's position on that case.
Are you open to reconsidering the position?
Yes.
The Attorney General Sessions also issued a memo limiting the use of consent decrees. This came up earlier in your hearing. And the limitation was on the use of consent decrees between the Justice Department and local governments. I'm asking then, within your first 90 days, will you commit to provide, if confirmed, providing this committee with a list of all consent decrees that have been withdrawn since Attorney General Sessions issued that policy? We'd like some transparency and information about what consent decrees have been withdrawn during the Sessions administration of the Justice Department. Would you commit to doing that?
Yes.
And if confirmed, will you commit to providing this committee with a list of any consent decrees that you withdraw during your tenure?
Throughout the tenure?
Yes.
Yes.
And if confirmed, within 90 days of your confirmation, will you commit to convening civil rights groups to listen to their concerns about this policy in the Department of Justice?
I will. I'm very happy to convene that group.
I'm going to interpret that as
I'm
a
not sure
commitment
about
that you
90
will?
days. Give me 120.
Okay, then that's fine. That's the agreement then, within 120 days. That's terrific. And then the Voting Rights Act, you're familiar, of course, with that, I'm going to assume, yes?
Yes.
Okay. And under the Act, the record of discriminatory voting practices, those states that have a record of such practices had to obtain federal approval in order to change their voting laws, as you know.
Yes.
And then came the 2013 Shelby decision, where the court, by a 5-4 vote, pretty much gutted the Act, ending the federal pre-approval requirement. So within weeks of that ruling, you are probably aware that legislators in North Carolina rushed through a laundry list of voting requirements. A federal appeals court later held those North Carolina laws to be intentionally discriminatory against African American voters, targeting them, quote, with almost surgical precision. Do you believe there are currently laws on the books that target African Americans or have the effect of discouraging African Americans from voting in our country?
Well, it sounds like those laws do.
Sure.
So
Do you have any concern about that there may be other laws that have the same effect?
I would be concerned if there are other laws, and that's why I would vigorously enforce Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
And would you make it then part of your mission to also, in spite of the fact that the Voting Rights Act has been gutted, to make it your mission to also become aware of any discriminatory laws in any of the states, including those that were covered by the Voting Rights Act because of their history of discrimination, and use the resources of the Department of Justice to ensure that there is not voter suppression happening in our country?
Yes.
Thank you. My time's up. I appreciate it.
It's very efficient. I think that's the end of the 2 rounds that I promised the committee we would do. I think Senator Rona, you have a few more questions?
Yes,
Is that
thank you very
correct?
much, and I thank Senator Kennedy as he was sitting in the chair to give me permission to go a little bit further. So I'll be as brief as I can. Last year, the Justice Department in Zarda versus Altitude Express, it was a Second Circuit case, argued that Title VII, filed an amicus brief